Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everyone from around the world. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening from wherever you are. As Sue said, my name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Director of Global Development with the Institute of Coaching, and I am really excited to be kicking off 2022 with a good friend of the Institute and the writer of this amazing new book called To Be Honest, Leading with Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose. We at the IOC have been wanting to have a webinar related to trust, ethical issues, and how to build our reputation as coaches to be ethical and grounded in honesty and integrity, not only in our private lives, but also in our practices. So we're really excited that Ron was able to give us time today. And for those of you that are not familiar with him, I just want to give you a little bit of background. Ron is the co-founder and the managing partner at a company called Navalent, based on the East Coast of the US. He works with CEOs and executives pursuing transformational change in organizations, leaders, and industries, and also serves on the advisory board of the Ethical Systems Group at New York University. He is a prolific writer, having written the Amazon #1 book, Rising to Power, and 8 other books, and the newest book, To Be Honest, that just came out last year, that he's going to share his research from, is his 9th book. He's also a contributor to Harvard Business Review, where one of his articles was named the top management idea for 2016. He's featured in Fortune, CEO Magazine, Business Insider, MSNBC, and the long list of media. So he's actually very well known in this very specific space around leaders and ethical behavior and integrity. So I am really excited to have him here. And the way we've decided in my discussions with Ron to set up this first webinar of the year was to have him give us some of the research and background and main themes from his book. And I would highly encourage you all to get a copy. It's actually really, really interesting and well written. So he's going to spend 20 to 30 minutes with us sharing some of his content and his research, and then we'll switch to a dialogue. So I want you to be thinking about your questions, think about your practice. Ron and I have been talking about some of the ethical dilemmas that I faced as a coach. And I'm sure many of you have, if you think back through your practices or you're just getting started in your coaching practice, you recognize that as coaches, we are often put in difficult dilemmas where we worry about our reputation. We deal with challenging clients who may skirt the truth or maybe not always operating in integrity at times. And we have a role to play and have to take responsibility for our position in these dynamics. So I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions, and I will encourage you to be putting them in the chat box. And so we'll switch into like a dialogue format and take as many questions as we can. So with that, I want to turn off my video and allow everyone to focus on Ron. Hi, Ron. Welcome.
Jeffrey, how are you? Good to see you, my friend. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thanks so much for having me. What a pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward to a really great and spirited conversation with you and all of our guests today. As Jeffrey said, everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm so thrilled to be with you today. It's a rare treat for me to be sort of among my own. The people who are sitting on this side of a table of leaders and clients, trying to help them be better and help their organizations be better. So it's a delight to be in what I call garrison, to be in the place where we're all learning and stretching and growing together. And I'm excited to share with you some of the research from the book that Jeffrey mentioned, and some of how I think it applies to us. I think it's important for me to take my own medicine and for all of us to take our own medicine. So I'm going to dive in here. And what was fascinating to me as I dug into additional research around how our field, how those of us on the helping side of the table define and face off with challenging or moral or ethical dilemmas. I found this one very interesting study, study of global coaches, about 400 or 500 of a sample. And when asked about facing a dilemma, a situation in which a difficult, moral, ethical choice had to be made, here's what they learned. 72% of coaches had 1 to 4 dilemmas in the last 12 months, and about 15%, only 15% said they had none. And they range anywhere from a clash between client value systems to managing their own weaknesses, the 2 largest ones, conflicting interests between sponsors and coachee, working with a client who diverts upon the agreed upon goals, confidentiality issues, and managing boundaries. So interestingly enough, the messiness of our field, which is, if you think about it, relative to many other industries and helping professions, we're relatively new. And so there is a little bit of a wild, wild west out there when it comes to who's a coach, who gets to be a coach, and who gets to claim they're a coach. Interestingly, people thought that the risks they were facing were loss of trust from their coach or sponsor, certainly doing harm to their client's development and damaging their own credibility. So the stakes are real and people feel them. So my hope today is to sort of unpack for you what I learned about honesty in my research and how to maybe avoid or sidestep some of the challenges here, or how to navigate them with grace and purpose and justice. First thing to think about is, when I zoomed out to do the research, I wanted to understand what are the conditions in which people will, in fact, behave honestly, and what are the conditions under which they won't. We've all probably grown very weary of the Theranos stories that we just watched the trial of, or the Volkswagen stories, or the Wells Fargo stories. But I wanted to know, what are the conditions in which good-hearted people, otherwise well-intended people, will make choices that they would otherwise later regret. And so what I found is that there are these 3 forces colliding in our workplaces, on our leaders and our clients, that make up honesty. One is truth telling. We have a lot of folks encouraging people to speak up. We are telling our leaders to create psychological safety. You have an entire campaign for equity and dignity in the workplace, for justice. And of course, we're all watching the world as we navigate and traverse this pandemic, really a reckoning with purpose, a rethinking of why am I here and why do I do what I do. Turns out in the neuroscience and in the social science as well, truth, justice, and purpose are closely related. To be labeled honest today, it's not enough to just sort of encourage truth telling, or we can't just relegate dignity and justice to the diversity inclusion folks. And we can't have our marketers purpose washing to make it look like we care. Turns out that saying the right thing, doing the right thing, and saying and doing the right thing for the right reason, that's the new bar for honesty. And we don't have to look around too far, do we, to see why it is we're in a trust recession these days. That trust is in a free fall. And so to set ourselves apart, to be the person a client chooses to entrust their development, their career, their hard decisions, their teams, their organizations to, the bar is appropriately high. But interestingly, there are even better reasons to think about this. So if you look at some of the statistics from other coaching organizations, in 2019, almost $3 billion were spent on coaching. There are 1.5 million searches done per month for coaching services. 99% of clients who've hired coaches say they're very satisfied, and 96% of them would repeat the process. According to ISPI, there's a 221% ROI on coaching services. And 70% report improvements in performance, communications, and relationships. So when you think about the performance of an industry, does it mean we're just in an advantaged category and good for us? Or is there risk of erosion? Because those become laurels to rest on that become dangerous. So how do we get ahead of that now? How do we make sure that this incredibly privileged place we've come to be as practitioners doesn't later become, how do we make sure our halo doesn't become a noose? So in my research, we discovered, we studied 15 years of interviews with more than 3,200 leaders in a variety of sectors from over 200 organizations. And we used some really sophisticated AI technology to do some of the quantitative work to create statistical models of the data. And we found that there are 4 predictable conditions in which, in fact, people will be honest, say the right thing, do the right thing, and say and do the right thing for the right reason, or they will serve their own interests first and withhold the truth. And those are a clear, consistent identity, be who you say you are, transparent decision-making, making trustworthy choices with honest conversations, fairness and justice and accountability, meaning putting dignity first, and then cross-functional collaboration, connect everyone to a bigger story. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the data we found in each, and then I'm going to put a coaching lens on each of these to talk about how I think they apply to us, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. So be who you say you are. Turns out when our values and words match, when our actions and words are aligned, we are 3 times more likely to have people trust us to tell us the truth. But when there's a gap, when there's a say-do gap, when we say one thing and do another, when the values we espouse, the purpose we espouse diverges from the actions people see, now you're 3 times more likely to have people lie or withhold trust from us. When we are transparent, when people believe that we're providing truthful information, when our clients never wonder what version of a story they're getting from us, now you're 3.5 times more likely to have people be truthful with us, do the right thing, and serve a broader good. But when people think they're being manipulated, when people wonder if we're withholding the truth, when people question whether or not they're getting the entire story, they're 3.5 times more likely to withhold trust from us. When our accountability processes are seen to be fair, when we treat our clients with dignity and justice, when we hold them to account for their commitments, we're 4 times more likely to earn their trust. But if we are overly harsh with our clients or overly lenient with them, if we let them off the hook, if we purchase their loyalty without pushing them and challenging them as agreed to, we're 4 times more likely to erode that trust. And lastly, pardon me, when our relationships with people who are different than us, so when our clients' values are different than us, when our clients' sponsors don't align with how we see the world, when we're able to build bridges to those who are different and create cohesive and functional relationships, we're 6 times more likely to earn the trust of others. But when we can't get past those clashes, when there's rivalry or tensions or misalignment, now you're 6 times more likely to have people withhold their trust. And the interesting thing about these statistical models is that they were cumulative. So if you can master all 4 of these behaviors, you are 16 times more likely to have people trust you, to treat you with honesty and to serve their own greater good as you coach them. But if you are weak at all 4 of these, if you suck at all 4 of these, now you're 16 times more likely to have people withhold their trust from you and really damage your reputation. So let's look at each one individually. So have you articulated and embodied your stated values to your clients? Do the clients know on what basis you practice, on what basis you deliver the information and the insights and the perspectives and feedback you deliver? When they see a say-do gap, do you acknowledge it? Do you tell them? And does the purpose you serve, does the meaning behind why you coach connect to your client's context? And have you helped your client see why it is that what you do matters to not just them, but the organization they serve? Here are some ways to think about coaching with purpose. Check in with your clients. Ask them what they believe you value based on your observations. In other words, if they had to decode you and say, here's the value system I think you operate with, what would they say? Do you regularly revisit your coaching values and principles? Do you articulate them well? If people go to your website or go to any of the collaterals that you have that talk about who you are, can people recognize what's important to you? Do you self-assess against them? Share those with your clients and ask them, do these principles resonate? Does this describe the kind of coach you want to work with? Being who you say you are, having a clearly articulated identity and making sure your actions align, that's the foundation of trustworthiness. It's when we waffle. It's when we flit from value to value, or we have way too much elasticity in how we practice. That's when we get into trouble and lose people's trust. Accountability. How do you hold your clients accountable with dignity and fairness? How do you contract with them to talk about the things they've committed to, and how you're going to bring them data on their progress, and how you're going to talk about the wins and the shortfalls. How do you discuss failures with them? Are you overly lenient? Are you overly harsh? How do you push and when do you push? Have you made it safe for them to freely acknowledge their failure to you? Is dignity at the core of their conversation? Remember, as leaders, their remit to their organization is as personal as they are. They are an expression of their leadership, of whatever their deliverable is to the organization, whether it's launching new products or delivering new revenue or treating patients or developing new drugs, whatever it is that they're accountable for, it is an expression of them personally. So when you critique it, when you talk about it, are you making sure there's enough dignity present for them to maintain a sense of self while they talk about how they have to improve? Do your clients know that no matter what, they will hear the truth from you, that you're not going to soft pedal it, that you're not going to sidestep it, that you're not going to withhold the truth, that you're not afraid of their defensiveness or afraid of their reactions in how you treat the information you or the perspective you have for them? When you challenge their thinking, do they understand that you care and that it's out of a sense of dignity that you want to push them to be better? Where do you get uncomfortable doing that? Where are the times you have to raise difficult issues with your clients hard for you? And have you acknowledged your own avoidance or discomfort or the fear of disruption to a relationship that may cause you to wonder how to present certain information? Are you empathic? Sometimes our empathy as helpers crosses a line and we want to rescue people. Do you know how to set the boundaries so that your empathy doesn't have to rescue your client or care more about a challenge than they care about it? Are you forthright and courageous without needing to be admired for it? Can you be direct and challenging without having the attention drawn to you? Very difficult in basic attachment theory. The way we attach to our clients gets challenged when our own psychic needs blend into the mix. Now, here's the reality. We're human. So transference and countertransference are real realities of our relationship. The question is, do we allow them to be used and discussed for our client's good, right? Or do we try and hide them? The relationship we have with our clients is in fact one of the most important laboratories for our clients to learn and grow. So they have to, by definition, have to challenge us to grow and be better as well. How we make choices. So do you make your decisions adapted to your client's context? Is governance in their organization the wild, wild west? Is it highly bureaucratic? Is it very consensus driven? And how do you adapt your choice making to not compromise your values, but still fit their needs? Do you invite dissent from your clients? Do you ask your clients to challenge your thinking? Do you ask them for alternative views? And of course, are you keeping appropriate confidentiality boundaries? When the sponsor asks you, so how's it going with your client? Do you navigate that conversation well? Do you get tempted to collude? Do you get tempted to purchase intimacy with information that needs to stay within the confines of the boundaries of your client relationship? Now, of course, all of us would answer the question, well, of course. But the reality is, when the rubber hits the road in those moments, and there's somebody pressuring you to cross a line, especially an information boundary, it can be very difficult to sort of find the right words to challenge and say, I'm sorry, we can't go there. Ask yourself, from the get-go, when you contract with your client and their sponsor, do you set the information boundaries very clearly? Do they know when and where they can go and where they can't? And have you made that clear from the get-go of your contract? How do you deepen your intimacy with your clients and by being curious and inviting information about their life, inviting information about their story without ignoring boundaries, without crossing boundaries you shouldn't cross? When you seek transference and countertransference, when you've been triggered, do you use it in the service of your clients and your own growth? Do you acknowledge that in the relationship, or do you try and contain it? Transparency increases our clients' ability to see us as consistent, and our consistency and predictability is one of the things that makes us trustworthy to our clients. And lastly, how we collaborate with our clients. Is the relationship mutually established? Do your clients enjoy you as much as you enjoy them? Have you established a rapport that makes you energizing for them, that makes, when they see you in their caller ID, when they see you on their calendar, do they get excited? When there are differences in value systems, when they see the world differently than you, when they value different things than you do you talk about that? Or do you try and minimize it? Do you make your relationship a laboratory for working through conflicts, so that when your clients have to go work with critical stakeholders that they have to serve or collaborate with, they're better prepared for that? Can you be vulnerable with your clients? Can they see your humanity without manipulating intimacy, without sort of contriving intimacy? Do you challenge your clients to pursue their theys? Everybody has a them, a person, a stakeholder, a nemesis, a person in the organization with whom they feel as a rival or someone they don't trust. Do you help your clients build bridges to places they want to avoid? How do you distinguish common ground from compromise? How do you find places where you differ in value systems with your client or their organization without feeling like you're compromising your own values? Can you delight in your clients? Can you show them joy and make them feel welcome and hospitable without making them feel like you're idolizing them? Do you use an affirmation appropriately, or do you use it in an aggrandizing way that overly builds them up? When people know that differences are respected, when they know that you can live in those differences and they can still participate in a trust-based relationship with you, they feel you are more trustworthy, versus when they feel like we're overly conforming to them in a way that makes them feel idolized or makes them feel catered to. So those are the 4 findings from my research. I'll end with one cool story from the book that I think, in a much larger context, I think tells a little bit about the joy we have in our clients' work. So in 1964, Manuel Yolanda started the FARC, the Communist Party of Colombia, with the intentions of trying to help the rural poor of Colombia from the oppressive communist government, or socialist government that was really mistreating especially the rural poor. But he was outnumbered. There were several hundred of him and 50,000 of the militia in the Colombian military. So they had to retreat and flee into the jungles and rainforests of Colombia, where Manuel met a much more nefarious thought leader of the time who began to radicalize their practices. And eventually the FARC began to grow through and raise their funds through ransom kidnappings, through drug dealings and drug trafficking, through illegal gold mining. And over the course of the next 40 years, were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, including children. And sadly, to up to 2016, when there was a peace agreement negotiated, was considered the second largest internal genocide in history. Tragic 4 decades of Colombia's history. In 2016, the Colombian government negotiated a peace treaty, to sort of a ceasefire with FARC. At that point, they had grown to as large as 18,000 combatants. But at that point, there were 14,000 militant combatants in the FARC living in the jungles and the rainforests of Colombia. Now the dilemma was, what do we do with them? It wasn't like the Colombian citizens were eager to welcome them home and say, hey, glad you're here. So what do we do with them? Fortunately, Jaime Gongora was a professor at the University of Sydney, a native Colombian, was an environmental scientist. And what he knew was that the rainforests and jungles of Colombia were vastly unexplored natural ecosystems that most scientists around the world were eager to explore. They knew that there were unidentified animal species and plant species, medicinal plants that could be harvested for greater good, that ecotourism from around the world would flock to be able to go see and explore those beautiful and vastly untapped environments. Well, Jaime's brilliant thought was, well, who better to help us build that industry, to build that work, than the people who've been living there for 40 years. So he built a training program called Peace with Nature, and began 100 at a time training the former FARC combatants to become citizen environmentalists. He trained them to be eco-tourist directors. He trained them to help them guide scientists through the jungles and rainforests to identify medicinal plants that they had found, to identify food sources, to identify poison sources, to identify animal and bird species that had been identified. He did that for many, many years, and to this day now, thousands of them have been trained and welcomed home. Some of the workshops he does were alongside military and police people, the very people they had fought with. And one of the things Jaime said in an interview was he never imagined environmental science being a source of redemption and a source of reconciliation the way it was. I think if you zoom out and look at the incredible redeeming power of honesty there, think about some of the clients we serve, the leaders who have been relegated to last resort, the leaders who have lost their way in their organizations, the leaders who've lost respect or done something unforgivable and have to rebuild, or they're just lost in the wrong role, or they're over their skis and the organization has questioned their credibility. We often meet leaders in places where their stories eager to be redeemed. And we get to be the Jaime Gongordas. We get to be the people who find a creative and powerful way through the power of honesty, sometimes hard data, sometimes hard stakeholder conversations, sometimes reconciliation, but we get to be the ones that help them redeem the stories of their leadership and of their participation in their organization. So I think this is a for me, when I discovered it in my research, it was an incredibly inspiring story to see what happens when you have two dissonant pieces of information, 14,000 militant combatants living in a place and in an environment that is desperate to be explored and scientifically cultivated. When you can see the story in a very different way, you now have the chance to redeem it. And I think when I think about the clients in my life over my career, and I think about the places where some of them began in fragile, precarious places where their careers were struggling, or they were struggling, or the teams around them had withdrawn their respect, or they had gotten their organizations into a ditch and needed to dig it out. And when I think about the power of honest data, honest conversations, hard self-reflection, and a complete rethinking of those stories, and some of the profound ways those stories prevailed, I think when I think about the sacred roles we get to play with our clients, you can't underestimate the power of honesty, of the truth we get to bring to our clients in the service of their transformations. So I'm going to stop there and turn off my screen and invite Jeffrey back on, and we can have a chat.
You want to take a drink of water, Ron? You're more than welcome to take a.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Take a breath and so this is awesome. And I'm just, as you were talking, I was noticing that there are people with us from literally, oh my God, it must be 10, 15, maybe 20 countries.
Wow.
Not just US, but really all over the world. And, it's a testament to the potential power, and maybe that's the wrong word, but influence that we can have as coaches in a world that desperately needs more ethical leaders. And I love what you did in your presentation and your research and transition, sort of translating, that we need to focus on the integrity and the reputation and the trust issues with our leaders that we work with, but we also need to self-reflect because it's what we represent that actually impacts others also. So I really, really appreciate that. And there are tons of great questions coming in. So I've been trying to think about the best way to start, but I love a couple of what I would call big picture questions. And maybe that's a good place to start. And then some folks have also mentioned some of their actual situations. I'm sure, as I said, many of us have faced challenging moments in our careers. So, but let's start with a big picture question that came in that I like from Chris, who's curious about the research and just how you would define trust. If there's a model that you like or a particular phrasing.
I certainly, there's a couple out there. So there's an instrument that I often use called the trust orientation profile, and it breaks down trust into 12 dimensions on continuums. And I love that model when I work with my clients. I also love the new book from your friends at Harvard, Unleashed.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, Frances, I think her
Frances
name is
Frey.
Frances
They
Frey.
had, and her partner Anne. They had break down trust into 3 pillars. Empathy, authenticity, and logic. Also an elegant model. I think at the end of the day, when I measure it with my clients, I measure it through attachment. How quickly are they disclosing to me? How quickly are they vulnerable with me? To what degree are they malleable to, my hard questions or sometimes my challenging perspectives? When they get defensive, which can often be healthy, right? When they get defensive, are they open to the conversation to explore the defensiveness that I probably needed to trigger to sort of get that out, right? So that's how I look to see, is there malleability, or are they canceling our coaching sessions, or are they tiptoeing around hard issues, or are they hijacking the conversation to avoid going to hard places? And so for me, I want to know, have they entrusted to me the hardest, messiest parts of what they want to work on? And then I have to ask myself, have I been honorable with that trust?
Yeah, that's very well said. I like that. That's great as a framing for us to step back and ask ourselves, what is the place that we're entering into with trust within ourselves and with trust with our clients?
Yep.
I like that.
Matthew, it's called the trust orientation profile.
Oh, okay. You can put it in the chat.
I can't remember Myron's last name, but Myron is his first name. The guy who built it.
There's a combination question that I'm pulling out of Natalie, and I'm just going to quickly scroll. Natalie Jobati, it looks like her name is, and oh, this person didn't put their name, but I love this theme that Natalie and this other person is bringing up about empathy, because the question is really, how do we track? One of the gifts that we have as coaches is being emotionally available and empathetic with our clients, right? So that you're asking them to share their pain, to lower their thresholds of resistance. But then how do we, as Natalie puts it, how do we prevent becoming too friendly with our clients after we work with them for many, many months and maintain that level of authenticity and balance? What advice would you say about that? Because I think it's a challenge.
I love the question, because we all know when empathy becomes codependence, right? We all know that, and here's
but wait. Do we all know when empathy becomes codependence? I want to know for sure that we all know that. I'm not so sure.
It's a fine line, right, Jeffrey? It's a fine line. But here's the thing I would tell you: when you hear the tone of your voice, of your empathy, flipping to reassurance, no, you're not that bad. You're being too hard on yourself. I don't know. When your empathy becomes reassurance, that's the time to check yourself. Because sometimes when our clients feel bad, that's common sense. They should feel bad. They did something.
It could be compassion.
Compassion is a different thing, and and you can be compassionate but firm. Oh, okay, that didn't go well. That probably wasn't your best choice. But let's talk about how we can do better. I'm sorry you're feeling bad. Let's talk about has your view of yourself become overly distorted. Let's talk about that. But when my empathy becomes the need to replenish my client's emotional deficit, that's when it becomes challenging, because now my need to be needed is being indulged. Right now, I feel important. I feel special. My client will love the indulgence of my ability to make them feel better.
Right. And
that's a different dynamic, right? And so you have to check yourself. What is it about my empathy that my client, first of all, is empathy what they need right now?
Great question.
Is compassion what they need? And I loved the article last week in HBR. I talked about going from sympathy to empathy to compassion. I feel for you. I feel with you. I care for you. And I love that continuum. But caring for them doesn't mean we have to care more than them. Or that we have to caretake.
Great distinction. Caring for is different from caretaking. I love that distinction. That's a really important distinction. And what you're saying is that as coaches, we want to track ourselves, right?
And I think we all, listen, we're humans too. We can't ignore our own psychic and emotional needs. This is a relationship, and it shouldn't be only depletive, right? It can be replenishing, but you have to remind yourself of what emotional needs is it okay to have met in this relationship, and what emotional needs are not meant to be met in this relationship, and be clear about that. And we all have to check ourselves. And I think when we can begin to discover what are the proclivities I have to indulging emotional needs that shouldn't get met here, that's okay, you're human. Where could I take those so that I don't burden my client with that?
Right. Yeah. So you can take whatever's going on for you outside of the coaching dynamic.
And for younger coaches, who've been only in the field maybe 5 or 7 years, supervision's a great way to do that. Find a more senior seasoned coach.
Have a sounding board. Yeah.
And have accountability and a sounding board and a place to work that out.
Yeah. One of the things we do here at the Institute of Coaching is have our discussion groups where people bring some of these ethical dilemmas or challenges and they get feedback from colleagues. So it's having those kinds of setups.
And I think, one of my hopes one day, Jeffrey, is that there's somehow, without being overly legislative, that we're all required to participate in a group like that. Right. Many of us might be afraid to, but gosh, the power of, you just become a transformed human and therefore a much better coach.
Right. And it will help the profession to become more of a profession.
Right? And we need that. We need the whole profession to want to rise up.
Right. So I am loving the question from Harriet Dodd. And I think she specifically points to one issue, but I think it also could be broader. And that is, she says, a key dilemma that many coaches face is coaching in a system where, for example, she's talking about climate change threatens everything. And they may or may not have, I'm assuming she means that they may or may not have that on their radar screen. But I also think there's just a number of dilemmas where we go into a corporate organizational system and discover that the individuals may have a great deal of integrity as individuals, but that the system they work in is like ignoring climate change, as she points out, or ignoring the impact of the drugs they're creating, or ignoring, something like that. So I'm curious what your thoughts are for coaches when we run into that, as she says, dilemma.
It is one of the key reasons I wrote the book, because many of my leaders were finding that their own value systems were eroding and compromising and fraying in systems that were inconsistent with their own values. And listen, that's reality. If every leader quit their job because of a values inconsistency, there'd be nobody working. So the question is for us as coaches immediately is first of all, helping our clients define what's tolerable. What are your core values? Can you lead from that place? Is the system really asking you to compromise them, or are you just projecting that onto the system? And get that clear. Once you decide that, in fact, yes, the value system is so contradictory to what I believe in value that it's compromising how I lead other people, you have a career question to ask. I think when the values conflict is between you and the system, meaning let's say you just are deeply impassioned for environmental stewardship, you may not want to take on clients in the gas and oil industry. Don't put yourself in a situation where your contempt for the client's behavior is going to get in the way of you being able to be a good coach, and your contempt will show.
Let me give you a dilemma about that, just to see what you would say about it. Because what if you as a coach are asked to go into an organization where the leader could be fairly high up in the organization and might be very influential on making a change, for example. And you could feel a little bit like you're being a hero because you're going in and saying, maybe I can really make a difference in this client.
I love it, Jeffrey. I love it. You just pushing my buttons. I love it. It's great. But here's the thing. If your coaching agreement was to talk about, to help advance the cause of environmental stewardship, then you're free to do that. But the minute you bring your own agenda.
That's the key distinction though, right? Is that what is the agenda that you're being hired to work on?
Because if you bring your own agenda, And now you're playing this sort of the Trojan horse game,
Right.
where I'll get into the guys of being executive coach, but if I get to the top, I can change his mind. That's incredible arrogance.
Yes. Yeah. You're trying to be the hero, basically.
And
right?
it's your own hero syndrome is kicked in. And here's the thing: if you're that impassioned about environmental stewardship that you'd be willing to compromise your own coaching ethics to go have impact, good for you. Go do that. Go become an executive coach in the environmental stewardship arena, where you can actually take your passion and your coaching and embody both of them freely. Don't put yourself in such a vicarious place where you're having to sort of bifurcate yourself and resent your clients. Then you're not helping anybody.
Right. But I think what you're also pointing to in that is making the conscious choice to have a self-reflective moment where you ask yourself, what are your intentions?
Yes.
Right? Are you there to serve the client, or are you there to serve a greater purpose, which may be a good purpose,
Sure.
but you're using the client to serve your own needs? And that's a really important distinction that we as coaches have to make. I know I'm involved with the Coaching Climate Alliance that is bringing a lot of our organizations, coaching organizations from around the world together. And I actually think it's a really important conversation for us to be having, like, how can we influence the world? Because we have a role to play, but it is also a very slippery slope around our agenda versus the client's agenda.
And I loved your comment about a reflective moment. I think as coaches, if we're not having one of those 2 or 3 times a day, I mean, because every story is different. One of the reasons I loved this field when I came into org behavior is because I learned in my 20s, I bored easily, and I couldn't do so. The story is never the same, whether it's different clients or the same clients and different challenges, which means every context requires us to go back and center and say, okay, who am I here to be? Who am I saying I'm being? Am I being who I say I am? And what is it I need to be for this moment? Which means to the woman who asked a brilliant, insightful question earlier about what happens when you have a 12-year relationship. I have many of my clients who I've worked with for years. I have to continually re-meet them. Like, one of the questions I ask clients I've been with for more than 3 or 4 or 5 years is, who did you become this year that I don't know?
What a great question as we kick off a new year.
Let me tell you who I became that you don't know, right? And so it resets the table to say, we're not going to go into old habits. By that point, you already have short talk. You have, you have the knowing glance. You can do the decline, you can go, and they know exactly what you mean. Sometimes that short circuit can be great. It can be efficient. But for the most part, if you're doing your job, they're not the same person 5 years later. And you should have had to grow with them, right, so that you can continue to be fresh and present for them.
Great. Really nicely put. I love this question from Zahia. I'm going to not pronounce her name or his name properly, but I just want to give him or her credit for the great question. Zahia Harish is asking, how do you find out what the organization's values really are? Because we can all read the mission statement.
Right.
Right.
And the values. And then there's what's really going on. A couple of things to do. First of all, when you're sitting outside your clients' offices or wandering the halls, watch the administrative assistants, watch the lower level people.
Great.
Who do they talk to? How much joy do they have on their face? How freely are they interacting? How formalized is it? Are they whispering? Watch what's happening in conference rooms. If you just observe and put your anthropologist hat on, within an hour, you can decode the culture pretty quickly. And then you can decide, is this an environment I thought I can do my best work in, or is this an environment where I don't know that I can be helpful?
I love one of the things you're pointing to that's really crucial that I learned very early on in my career, even before I was a coach, when I was an HR manager at Booz Allen and Hamilton, is that when I really wanted to know what was going on in the organization in terms of the values, in terms of the truth, in terms of who I could trust, it was the junior level folks. It was the administrative people. It was the people behind the scenes that would often really know what's going on. And if you could build rapport with those folks, then they would tell you, and
Absolutely.
and transparency about what was really going on, because the folks at the top sometimes have other agendas. Not that they're
Oh,
bad,
well,
not that they're bad people, but that they
no, but they have different political lenses and different personal ambitions.
right.
Another thing to do is to simply ask, as somebody just pointed out the fact that the virtual world makes that a little bit harder to do. You can't lurk in the hallways.
Good
But
point.
to ask, but one of the questions you can simply ask people is, when a new employee starts, when you take them out in the hallway and say, okay, here's how things really work around here, what do you tell them? What are the things, what are the things you transmit culturally? What's the tribal knowledge you pass on to new members of the tribe to help them be successful? That'll give you lots of what you need to know in terms of, okay, so this is how they share information. This is how they make decisions. This is who they find the influencers, right? So there's ways of operative narratives. What are the stories operating in the culture that people, act on and live by? And sometimes you have to sort of test, right? So in a meeting on Zoom or otherwise, challenge, just saying, hey, I'm just curious. There's clearly a very strong prevailing view in the room here. Anybody see anything different? And is it like really loud silence and uncomfortable silence? Or does somebody say, actually, now that you say that, I do have a. So sometimes you have to poke the bear a little bit to sort of test the boundaries of the culture to see what it can tolerate.
I mean, I think that's our job. Right?
It is our job, absolutely.
At the end of the day,
always respectfully, but it's our job.
Right. There's a great question from Lupe, and again, I'm not sure if Lupe is male or female, so I don't want to, but I can pronounce the last name Wood, Lupe Wood, talking about the effects of the pandemic on integrity and trust, and wondering whether or not you think it's actually been suffering, or because of the adversity that we've all been facing. I'm wondering if maybe it's gotten better. But that's just
is the question about the industry itself, Jeff, or is it?
Well, I'll just read you the specific question. What effects do you see, if any, of the global pandemic? Does integrity and trust suffer under adverse situations?
I've seen it bifurcate. I've seen people be opportunistic. That backfired. I think we all have watched. The world has grown increasingly intolerant of and thank God for that. We've also seen this groundswell of compassion, ingenuity, creativity, willingness to help. We've seen people's hearts unleashed on behalf of those who are suffering. And I think that's the reason behind a huge part of this mass exodus out of the workplace, right? I have now experienced a much more expansive experience of my own soul. I don't think I want to put it back in the can. I think I like it this way. And the organization, they feel like the organizations are asking of them to be less. And I think people are like, life's too short. I hope, however, they'll never be, we're not going back to anything, right? Whatever the new normal is going to be in this new, somehow hybridization, I love your word, hybridization of work. It's not going to be what it was. I certainly hope that as that stabilizes in some form, the ingenuity, the compassion, the things the best parts of humanity that we saw, I hope we somehow are able to keep some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we at the Institute of Coaching did a study of executives that we just put out called Leading with Humanity. And one of the big takeaways from that was that once the pandemic really changed the work dynamics that the leaders had to deal with, it became very clear that this false dichotomy between our lives and our work was falling away. And that in order to have highly productive, trustworthy, connected, collaborative teams, leaders had to start to pay attention to the emotions, the anxieties, the life, the places that people are living because they were working out of their houses, and so they had to be more humane. Yep. And I think that I'm hoping, and I think you're pointing to that actually increased the level of transparency and integrity that leaders were demonstrating if they wanted to be effective. Now, whether or not that will last, I'm also optimistic that there'll be no going back.
I agree. Because what leaders discovered was, well, if my job wasn't inspection and surveillance and to our last conversation about management walking around, and all the things I thought I added value to, now I have a different question to ask about what's the value that I create as a leader if I can't do all those things? Great question. You can figure it out. Now there's all kinds of new ways you can create value that people really need from you.
Yeah,
Good
it's
point,
great.
Ursula, about ethnographers. Yes, they are great coaches because ethnographers see behavior in its most pure form. So it's a great point, Ursula.
Yeah, we're getting some really, really great questions. I'm going to go scroll back to Mubarak, who asked, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self? What a great question.
My gosh. I'll borrow a phrase. I read it in an article this morning, but I think I would have said, stop working so hard to prove yourself and just work on improving yourself. At that part of your life and career, you're so obsessed with other people's opinions and views of you and winning other people's, admiration and regard. You lose yourself. And I think today's 20-year-olds more than ever, thanks to the pains of social media, are suffering levels of anxiety and depression and self-contempt because of their addiction to self-comparison and all the ways, the yardsticks they hold up to themselves that they shouldn't be holding up to themselves. And so I wish people in their 20s, certainly me, would have known that, I remember somebody making the joke to me. It was a quip that said, in your 20s, you're worried about what everybody thinks of you. In your 30s, you decide you don't care what people think of you. And then in your 40s, you realize no one was ever thinking about you at all. So
let go of it earlier.
Why? That's 20 years of capacity you could have redeployed somewhere else to do something much more satisfying than worry about it.
Well said. Absolutely well said. So another one of the questions that Mubarak asks, I think is also extremely relevant, which is once you've established trust, how do you maintain it?
Well, and the first thing it's a fabulous question. Never take it for granted. Check in with your clients, have some way of checking on the intimacy, the vulnerability, the relationship, the connection. How can I be more helpful to you? And when you get the, no, you're great. Say, no, really, tell me one thing I can do better, and push them to push you. Because their willingness to settle for, no, really, you're great, is telling you that they're comfortable. And maybe there's a bit of that comfort that's not necessarily trust-based, but comfort-based. So always be checking on the emotional barometer or the emotional thermometer of your relationship, and have, even if it's only every 6 months, make sure you're pausing to say, how are we doing? There was a question earlier, I just wanted to address really quickly, Jeffrey, because I think it's relevant to what you guys do with these.
Great. Yeah, I'm scrolling through, so I'm not getting all of them.
There's a couple of folks that talked about, what are the boundaries between therapy and coaching?
Oh, good question. Yes.
It was a great question. But I know that Carol, your colleague Carol Kaufman, has done some really interesting work and writing on those boundaries and differences, which I think today we see are blurring by the day. We see many, many therapists coming into the coaching field. I would love to see more coaches get behavioral science training, right? There was an interesting, in my research for this talk, in fact, I came across this really interesting academic study that was done. The sample was both professionally or clinically trained coaches and then experience-based coaches, so people who are former executives coming into the coaching field. And the differences between them, Jeffrey, it was kind of scary. How many of the experience-based coaches that came out of executive leadership roles were less concerned about the connection to strategy, were less concerned about behavioral sciences, and they were just basically replicating their own experiences in their clients. And so I think even if you're not a clinically trained coach, getting some basic understanding of behavioral science, some basic understanding of transference and countertransference and triggers and all the things that happen in the relationship, some basic recognizing when you see, even if you shouldn't diagnose it, when you recognize pathologies that are beyond your coaching in front of you, just enough to recognize it. I so wish, and that's why I love the work you guys are doing at IOC, because it's such an important conversation for you guys. Right. We all need to have some behavioral science basis upon which we coach, or we're going to be dangerous, right? If we may have a 30-year phenomenal track record as an executive who led well, that basis of success is probably not sufficient to replicate it into advice. Mostly what you're doing is cloning yourself. And so it's important that you get some training, get some knowledge of understanding of how behavior manifests and how it changes.
Well said. Yeah, well, I think that's one of our goals at the Institute is develop resources and build out accessible education programs for coaches to learn some of the more psychological, empathetic, different core principles that are actually many of which come from the psychology's behavioral sciences. So that's
one of my tests is that when I meet coaches, I ask them, have they what of Canterbury's work have they read? And I'm always shocked when they say who, and that tells me immediately that okay, you're coming from a different place. Todd Churches, thank you for your call out for Jeffrey's book Flex. It is an incredible book. I actually had to be on the lookout for next week. I have a wonderful Forbes article coming out that I had the privilege of interviewing Jeffrey for great insights about.
Oh, wow, that's right.
About the pandemic and about the hybridization of work and what that means for leaders. So great insights. Stay tuned for that as well.
One last question. We have 2 minutes. You'll have to make this one quick, but it's actually the very first question that came in. So I've been wanting to ask it, but wanting to kind of give some context. So Chris McCrum asked, what would you consider an example of a kind of accountability system? Like if a client said, we really want to be in integrity, we really want to build a trusting environment, what kind of an accountability system could we put in place?
That you start between making sure, throw out or redo their performance management system, because today those systems are, especially if they're ratings based, if they're categorization based, all the neuroscience we learned in research says that when you're categorizing people, you're triggering them, right? I had one client, one of my coaching clients, get on a call with me right after his performance review, and he was a top successor for a big job. He was well regarded, and his veins were coming out of his neck, and he'd start, she gave me a 3. I'm always a 4, but now HR says there's a quota, so I get, how got the 4s? He was out of control. And I asked him to send me the forms, and I read them, and they were actually very affirming and very accurate, but the number. Turns out our amygdalas, when we get categorized, when we get labeled, we feel invisible, we feel threatened. So his brain was responding the way our brains are wired to respond. So make sure your accountability systems are grounded in recognizing that today, the workplace is the contributor and the contribution are fused. Used to be that the contribution was objective. How many t-shirts did you print? How many claims did you file? How many cases did you close? Today, the remits are your analysis, your creativity, your ideas, your challenging thought. So the contribution is a reflection of the contributor. It's a different kind of dignity with which we talk about that. Make sure leaders understand how to talk about how contribution is measured, where it falls short, how to honor it in a way that acknowledges it is a reflection of the contributor. It's no longer enough to say it's not personal, because it is personal. The forms and the processes can follow, but if the relationship between the leader and those she leads is rooted in dignity and understanding of fairness, the other thing I would say is, does everybody in the organization have a chance to be successful as everybody else? If you have privileged roles, that privilege is disadvantaging somebody. So if your engineers are privileged in your tech company, or your salespeople are privileged in your growth company, or your marketers are privileged in a brand company, take care that those who don't share those privileges feel like they can't be successful.
Yeah, well, that is well said, because it leads to bigger challenges around social justice and equity and gender.
Everywhere. And so those are the 2 places I'd start.
Wonderful. Good thoughts. So much information. I really appreciate your taking the time to just give us a taste. And I want to let everyone know that if you're interested in continuing the conversation, I'm going to have Ron back next week on LinkedIn Live for 30 minutes. So pumped up. I'm going to pump up my questions and get him going on all of these to another level. So hopefully we'll see you then. And I just want to thank you, Ron, for taking the time to joining us today. It was fascinating. It's rich. It's super, super important information. Everybody go out and get this incredibly wonderful book called To Be Honest by Ron Carucci. And I want to thank you for joining us from all over the world. And we will see you again in a few weeks. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Jeffrey, thank you so much.